watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
Hello, I'm Mark Golub, and in our endeavor to bring to you some of the most creative and innovative people on the world Jewish scene, it's my pleasure now to introduce you to Scott Shay. And I want to tell you a little bit about Scott. While his day job is working as chairman of the board of Signature Bank of New York, he's one of the most active Jews in the New York metropolitan area. Scott is on the board of UJA Federation of New York, and he's on the board of the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education. Scott is also a member of the Birthright Israel Steering Committee, and for some time he chaired the Fund for Jewish Education. And Scott and his wife Susan are the founders of the Jewish Youth Connection, which really is an outreach to parents who want to do Hebrew education for their children and are not part of a synagogue situation. And as if this weren't enough, in 2007, Scott authored what I consider to be, Scott, a daring book entitled Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry, a book which begins with some dramatic interpretations of Jewish demographics in America from 1980 to virtually the present, and which culminates in Scott's prescription for how to re-energize American Jewish life. And Scott, I've wanted to sit with you for so long. Thank you for giving me some time.
Mark, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I want to know first, Scott, the book was done in 2006, 2007.
Right.
To what extent are the demographics that you wrote in this book, that you cite in this book, to what extent do you still feel that they are accurate? Would you go back and would you modify any of the, again, I use the word dramatic and I use the word daring, because, Scott, what you said about American Jewish life, and let me just tell our audience, what Scott says is that sometimes we use the wrong number when we try to identify how many American Jews there really are in this country. There were a little more than 5 million, 5.2 million back in 1980, and then there were a series of Jewish censuses taken, and Scott's argument is that the number that's normally cited, which is still around the same 5 million, is a little bit less, is really an inflated number. Do I have it correct?
You do.
Okay. Explain why you feel it's inflated and to the extent to which you are still committed to those numbers.
Well, the last comprehensive survey of American Jewry was done in 2000. And that was done by the at the time it was called United Jewish Communities. In order to qualify as a Jew for that survey, you didn't actually need to self-identify as Jewish. You were to meet UJC's definition of whether or not you were Jewish. So it was a pretty elastic definition. And when I look at the data a little more deeply and try to figure out who are, the term I use is core Jews, people who are committed to their Jewish identity, actually the number is a lot lower, probably more in the range of 4.3 million, who are committed Jews whose identity as a Jew is one of their major identities. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't other people who are parents of two Jews but just don't consider themselves Jewish, or people who by any definition of Jewish wouldn't consider themselves as Jewish but self-identify as Jews. That 4.3 is a core number. And what's more important to me about the number, because I'm not really worried about an absolute number, I'm worried about whether or not we're growing or shrinking. That's, I think, the most important thing for any ethnic group, religion, any organism. Are we going up the ladder like Jacob or down the ladder?
But I want to remind you, you also take another 300, 400,000 Jews out of that in a very interesting way, in which I think you're absolutely correct. So I want you to speak about that for a moment.
In terms of people who don't consider themselves
No, you talk about in your book the fact that the number includes now about 300,000 to 400,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union,
Right.
who came into this country and are included in the 4.2. And therefore, if you were to do a constant, your book argues,
Yes.
it really would be under 4 million. Where we began and where we are after 2000, in your book,
Right.
it's like 3.9, because you take out the influx of that 400,000 immigrants, because they're not,
Right.
you wouldn't be comparing
Apples to apples.
Right.
So they're in the number. They're Jews who are today, which
Right,
is why
of
I was.
course.
But what my point is that, again, that's in terms of the growth. So if you look at 1980, at 5.2 million Jews who were here, or whatever, in 1980, 5.9 million Jews who were in 1980.
Correct.
And then you try to compare on what we call a static pool analysis. In other words, you try to eliminate people who either left the pool or came from outside of the pool. The real 5.9 compares to about 3.9.
You argue we've lost 2 million Jews.
Domestic Jews, if you will. Now, that's not to say that those Russian Jews and other
Of
immigrants
course.
aren't important and are
Right.
here and we want to
But
grow.
they should have added to the 5.9.
Exactly. That was my point,
Okay.
is that the growth, the shrinkage is even worse than the headline numbers.
Okay. Out of curiosity, did you get any flack for using that number 3.9?
I did. It's ended up being a controversial number. As a matter of fact, I've, in the beginning of 2008, updated the book with a second edition where I added an appendix actually detailing some of the subsequent studies, which in some cases took direct aim at the numbers that I showed and tried to parse those. And without going into greater detail, I would say that the studies that have been done subsequently, unfortunately, I think corroborate the numbers that I present more than anything else. Now, this upcoming year, UJC, or in the last year, should I say, UJC made a decision not to do another study. So we actually won't have an overall picture
Why
of
is
all. Well, a few reasons have been given. Number one, the expense. The last study cost, if I'm not mistaken, something like $6 or $7 million, and now it's called a different name, but UJC basically decided they didn't want to spend the money. And a number of other major cities are doing studies, so the hope is that a lot of those studies can be added up. For example, Chicago's in the midst of a study. New York traditionally does a study every 10 years as well. So I think that UJC is frankly trying to save money. And in this era, as we all know, of shrinking Jewish economic resources for these kind of studies, that's it's a real consideration.
It seems that it's important for a community to know what their numbers are and to know that kind of demographic subheadings are part of this Jewish community.
Yep.
Scott, is there any possibility that the reason why we're not doing it is we don't want to see those numbers?
I think that's a possibility. Look, someone can have high blood pressure, and just not take their blood pressure, go to the doctor. And if they don't, that's not going to make the blood pressure get any better. They still need to go and figure out what the issue is, find out the numbers, and figure out if there's a prescription for healing and renewal. So I don't want to cast any aspersions, but I would have to say there's certainly some folks who would prefer not to do these studies.
I want to take a step back now. I want to talk about you for a moment. Who the heck you are in terms of this Jewish picture. I already said you come from Wall Street. You're a banker. You were involved with Bank Poalim, correct?
I was on the board of Bank Poalim for 8 years, and I was part of the group, the American group that was the group that privatized Bank Poalim. It used to be owned by the government
of
and
Israel,
by the Histadrut, which is sort of like an AFL-CIO, if you will, of Israel.
Yes. So you have been involved in banking as a profession your whole life.
More or less, yes.
Okay. And then something bothered you.
Right.
What did you see as you navigated through these Jewish communal organizations and your own personal experience with Jewish life? Instantly, where do you fall in terms of the movement of Judaism? Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, what?
Well, I'm a member of Congregation Kilat Jeshurun, which is an Orthodox synagogue, and I consider myself a traditional Jew in that I take the tradition of Judaism very seriously. I hate labels per se, Reform, Reconstructionist, Orthodox. I think we're all Jews. I think we are all in different places on the observant spectrum.
Good for
and
you.
I take it seriously.
You're absolutely right.
But I don't like, I really, and in the book, I didn't mention that purposely, where I stand precisely, because we all have this tendency that, well, if a Republican's saying it, I'm a Democrat,
Right.
well, I don't
Right,
quite
right,
believe it, or if
right.
I'm a Republican, vice versa. So my view is...
You wrote it as a Jew.
I wrote it as a concerned Jew.
Okay, so
That's
now
it.
what did you see and again, you're at the high levels of Jewish leadership.
Right.
What did you see that bothered you enough to say, we need a business plan? And by the way, again, I mentioned the demographics begin your book. The overwhelming majority of your book is your suggestions for how to re-energize Jewish life.
Right.
It's really your business plan for going forward in the Jewish community. But
Right.
something you saw, or some things you saw, as you experienced Jewish life, bothered you enough to encourage other people to write this book, and when they didn't, you
Right.
wrote it yourself. I want you to describe to me what you saw that bothered you.
Okay. And I'll put it in business terms a little bit, too.
Okay.
It goes back to what I was saying. When I wrote this book, the real time that I became bothered, I was chair of something called the Commission on Jewish Identity Renewal, which was one of the parts of the UJ Federation that distributes the funds that are raised. And it's a great organization consisting of wonderful and cherished colleagues. The one thing I saw as I started talking to other funders, is that it seemed like there were so many ideas out there, but there was a lack of prioritization. So in a business, if you have 25 products, you probably have too many. If you don't figure out the products that are working and the products that aren't working. There was too little of that, of actually looking at numbers and saying, is what I'm doing, is what I'm trying to accomplish effective or not effective? So I looked at a number of programs and said, great idea, really like it, but you know what, it's just not effective.
I thought you were going to say something like this. You know, Mark, I've been in all these organizations. I see the Jewish world around me here in America, and I'm worried about where we're going. I see fewer and fewer young Jews know about Israel, are committed to Israel, visit Israel. I see the degree of philanthropy in the Jewish community going to Jewish causes decreasing over time. I had an instinct that the numbers of our people in America were diminishing, and all of these things troubled me. They troubled me for the potential Jewish future, if not in general, then in America. And I care about the future of Jewish America. I care about where our young people are going to go. And I said to myself, something has to be, some plan, you call it a business plan,
Right.
some plan has to be developed to address what I see happening all around me. Now, I thought that was where you were going to
Well,
start.
that's actually a pretty good précis in my introduction to the book, is that, and you did a great job for me. But in terms of the thing that bothered me, that's why I wrote the book in terms of my underlying assumption as to why I was bothered. The reason I wrote the book was because I was trying to get specific, but I will say this. I believe passionately that we Jews were put on this planet for a purpose. And if we aren't going to do something to make this world a better place, then we shouldn't be here. There's no point in all of this. So I took that as an assumption. And building on that assumption, then I tried to write a book for revitalizing ourselves. But as you were in the book, my view, and I say this in the last few chapters, if we don't actually act as an or l'goyim, as a light unto the nations, then let's forget about the first 9 planks Only the 10th plank is really the reason for our being here, but we're not going to be able to actualize being a light unto the nations, actually providing an example for moral lifestyle and morality, not only as a people, but as a country in Israel, if we don't do the things that we need to do effectively to maintain our own stature, because, or even viability. Because what I worry about is that years ago, and I'm not talking lots of years ago, think of the Soviet Jewry movement. We were able as American Jewry to really galvanize ourselves and sort of contribute. We weren't the primary mover, but we were one of them in bringing down the wall, bringing down the Berlin Wall. You can draw a line from the activism, from the refuseniks, from the support that was received in America, and that had impacts on the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and had a whole bunch of stunning and profound impacts on our foreign policy and impacted the world. And what I worry about is that we can't do that, necessarily muster that again today. There are important human rights tragedies happening in the world. They're important. We're sitting here today as the disaster and nightmare in Haiti is unfolding. Are we as a Jew, do we as a Jewish community have the vital signs, have the stamina, have the physical ability to impact those things? Because if the answer is that we don't, then frankly, the worst fate is upon us as Jews, and that is irrelevance. Because the last thing we Jews want to be is irrelevant. Then we've really let down our mission, and we don't have a reason for being.
Scott, what touched you in your own young life to make you understand what you just said to me? What experiences were there? I don't know who your mother and father were. I don't know what you did as a teenager or as a young college student that engaged you in the kind of activities you're describing now. But can you point to one or two or more?
Sure.
Tell me.
Well, first, I mean, and it's a deep part of my, my existence. My father was a survivor. His entire family was wiped out. He was born in Schwetzner, Lithuania, and saw his father literally put in a separate line from him. And my father survived by slave labor. My mother and father both cared about the Jewish community. I mean, I will always remember my mother and my father. On occasion, my father would bring home people from literally the street. In those days, today they're called homeless people. In those days, they were called bums. And he'd bring them from the south side of Chicago, and he would give them an old coat, and my mother would make something for them to eat. And then they would be off. My father would give them some money, not a lot. My parents really didn't have a lot. My father was a carpenter, then a carpenter contractor. But tzedakah wasn't just writing a check to them. Tzedakah was really doing something. And
you saw this.
And I saw it. And I have to tell you, people would come in my house, and I remember being a very small child. I'd almost be afraid of them. I mean, these would not be the normal people who would walk into one's home. And yet my parents really took it very seriously. And that, I remember the image today as clearly as I did, then. I'd say the other thing that the other formative aspects for me were I spent 2 years at Ida Kron Jewish Academy in Chicago. I transferred there. And that gave me a basis of Jewish learning. And then in my time in college, I spent a year in Israel. I spent a junior year abroad.
In what?
I was at the Hebrew University, and I actually had a great experience in the sense that my school, my college, had a rule that in order to study abroad, you had to take the classes there in Hebrew or in the local language. It didn't matter where. In Israel's case, it was in Hebrew. So I really had to learn Hebrew. And as I like to recall, I learned a lot of economic terms. I could talk Heitzav, Bikushi, Vadaut. all sorts of technical terms, ashray. I could talk about a lot of things in Hebrew very technically. I had trouble actually getting on a bus and explaining where I wanted to go. I just had enough sort of neurons to figure out in the time the economic terms. So, but I had a great experience, and that really forged my connection with Israel.
So now I want to talk about, you call them planks in your book.
Right.
Each plank is another suggestion, a strategy for how to energize, I say re-energize, the Jewish community. And I want to ask you to just, I'm going to pick some of the ones that I like.
Sure.
I mean, they're 10 beautiful planks. And then I just want you to just sort of free associate with them, if that's okay. You begin 1 and 2 with education.
Right.
You talk about it. Hebrew schools is number 1, strengthening the Hebrew school experience, and then day schools for more Jews.
Right.
So, Scott Shay, talk to me about why you would start there.
Hebrew schools. I think if we as a Jewish people really don't make it as a people in America, I think the reason will be, if sociologists, they won't be Jewish, years ago were looking back and studying this Jewish people, I think they'll say the reason that the Jews didn't make it in the U.S. is because Jewish parents thought, erroneously, that they could subcontract the formation of their children's Jewish identity to Hebrew schools.
As opposed to?
Doing it themselves.
Oh, you're so right.
And so I think Hebrew schools are important. I think, and I go in the book, I detail in the book a variety of ways that Hebrew schools can be improved. And I have 4 basic, I don't want to get into them now, but 4 basic proposals. But I don't think that the best Hebrew school can be successful unless the parents care. Going to Hebrew school is important, and we're going to rearrange our life a little bit and inconvenience us all a little bit to get you there. 2, that it's coupled with youth movements, a trip to Israel as a teen, that's the best time actually, and camping, Jewish camping. But even all of that won't matter unless parents take the time and the opportunity to make Friday night dinner at home with their families and to say, hey, at least Friday night, we're going to have family time in a Jewish context. And I think that if one doesn't send their children to day school, but one just does Hebrew school, a quality Hebrew school, again, camping, a trip to Israel, and a youth movement, and most importantly, Friday night dinner.
Most importantly,
Friday night dinner.
Shabbat dinner.
Shabbat dinner. You know, and it doesn't need to be some very complex thing, but Shabbat dinner with kiddush and challah.
Two candles.
I think,
and the children know with absolute certainty they will have their parents with them for that night.
And I think that's the way we can build committed and concerned Jews for the next generation. So that's number 1, and that's why I started with that.
But we ultimately, by placing so much emphasis on the Friday night in the home experience, and the home experience, and I think you're 1,000% correct, the Hebrew education, the religious school, the Talmud Torah, becomes an adjunct, not a replacement for or a substitute for core Jewish identity.
That's correct. The Hebrew school has to be in the context. That's why I started out. I talk to parents who think, I'm going to send my child to Hebrew school, and they'll take care of all of that Jewish stuff. We can't subcontract our children's identity in any way, shape, or form to somebody else.
So I have 2 questions for you. Number 1, you know there are many people who feel that the Hebrew school, the Talmud Torah experience, has been to one extent or another a failure.
Yes.
And I recently spoke with Michael Steinhardt, who said Hebrew school are 2 of the worst words in the English language referring to the Jewish people. And if you saw the movie the Coen brothers did, A Serious Man, have you seen it?
I haven't seen it yet.
You've got to see it, Scott. A Serious Man has in it the Coen brothers' depiction of what it was like. I laugh thinking of what it was like for them as young people in the 50s, 60s, going to a Hebrew school where there was a total disconnect between whoever was up in front of the room declining the verb halach,
Right.
and the kids sitting there glazed, just glazed. And very often, well-meaning educators, well-meaning Jewish adults don't understand the extent to which Hebrew school does not speak to the individual who's sitting at the desk. And I'll say one more thing, then I want to hear you respond. Education always is best if the content of the education is something the student is interested in. If a student is interested in it, and sometimes it's because a professor or a teacher makes it interesting. Some of the best classes we all have at college were classes we would never have thought the subject was important, but the teacher was dynamic and wonderful. That's not what you normally get in Hebrew school Talmud Torah, the classic Hebrew school. Very often there's a disconnect between what we want to teach our young people and what they're ready to learn.
Right.
How do you address that problem?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. Susan and I both called ourselves refugees from Hebrew school. As a matter of fact, she went to a reform Hebrew school, and she called it reform school. So that's why we decided to try to start a Hebrew school. We'd have a blank slate, and we'd actually do it ourselves and start from scratch, literally from a blank piece of paper. So there's no doubt that Hebrew school needs to be reinvented. And again, I've gone into this in detail because I could spend a half hour talking about the things Hebrew schools need to do to reimagine themselves, to reinvent themselves, and to look at Hebrew school from the perspective of the child sitting in the chair, as opposed to all of those things we want to get to that child in the chair. We have to start by being much more child-centered.
By being more
child-centered.
Understanding who this person is.
Right.
Good for you. What experience have you had with your own endeavor here?
Well, we've grown from 4 students to about 85 students currently.
Wow.
There's only so much we can expand to be, but
where is this done? Where's this
it's
conducted?
actually housed at the Congregation Kilat Jeshurun, but it's non-denominational. There are children from literally all walks, many who are not currently members of of synagogues. That's a large part of our audience, and I would tell you it's been a tremendously rewarding experience.
Do you think there's anything, either programmatically or in terms of content, that is unique or different about the approach you have?
Well, I do think there's one part that's unique, and it actually is that we teach Hebrew with big brothers, big sisters, as it were. So college students teach Hebrew one-on-one, Siddur Hebrew one-on-one, which tends to take the drudgery out of learning Hebrew. It also allows them to form a personal connection with someone who's not so far removed, but is still a teenager or in their early 20s. And I think that's very important. We try to bring fresh energy from our teachers. We have teachers who are trained, because I think a part of the problem is that many Hebrew school teachers don't have a deep Hebrew school educational background. I think that's very important. And so we try to do that. But I'm not here to disparage any other Hebrew school.
Of course.
We're just trying to take all the things that we've learned, that Susan and I have learned, and that we've learned from the research. We spent a lot of time looking at the research and saying what works and what doesn't. And I think that's a lot of that experience is informed, or part of that experience informed the book, which is that we can do a better job on Hebrew school. But again, the parents have to be involved.
But I couldn't agree with you more. I want to tell you, by the way, in my own situation, and I've been teaching young people in a, quote, Hebrew school setting since 1972, a parent is required to study with the student.
Very important.
No student is accepted to a school, to a class, unless a parent comes with them. And the parent isn't there as an observer. The parent there is as a student. And you know, many parents are have as little knowledge of Hebrew or Jewish values or Jewish education as the children they're sending to the school. And when I grew up, the model was always the drop-off. The parents would drive up, drop the kids off, and then pick them up. And my own sense is that by saying to a parent, If you want your child educated, you must educate yourself with the child. And there's rarely a situation in which young people get to study with their parents, or parents have the joy of studying with their children. But I have found that if you say to a parent, if you expect us to educate your child, you must be educated with, every time your child comes, you come. Your child has a homework sheet, you have a homework sheet. Your child does a review sheet or some kind of quiz, you take the quiz. And I have found that to be a very effective way of not only creating a bond between parent and child, but also saying to a child, this isn't simply children's stuff.
Well, I think that's a great model. I actually think one of the problems with Hebrew school models is that we need more models.
Yes.
I mean, we're sort of stuck in this rut that was started in the 1920s in terms of a model for Hebrew schools. And I think that model ought to be available. It ought to be available all over the country. Other models ought to be available all over the country. I love it when I listen to it. So for some people, Shabbat school, having the parents there for a Shabbat experience might be all that they can do.
Absolutely right.
And then having class during the week as well. But having Shabbat be the center of the learning experience, for some people that works. I think we just need more models.
Scott, we have to pause and then we're going to continue.
Okay.
I have the pleasure of speaking with Scott Shay, who is not only the chairman of the board of Signature Bank of New York and a member of the board of Federation of New York. He is the author of Getting Our Groove Back, a marvelous book which suggests ways in which American Jewish life can be re-energized. And when we meet again next week, we're going to look at all the ways in which Scott suggests it's possible to specifically work on programs, he calls them planks, to re-energize American Jewish life. So I hope you join us again. As always, I invite any of you who wish to be in touch with Scott Shay or who want to have some feedback to the ideas expressed by the two of us, please email me or write me this week. And if you want to be in touch with Scott, I will forward any emails that you send me to him. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.